Some of her initial case studies in the new book, they've added to, but some really, really aggressive mall retrofit strategies, creating whole downtowns around where suburban malls were. Colorado having some really great examples. Urban planning, when we do our Denver field trip every 4 or 5 years or so, these are key points on our Denver field trip. So if you have a Denver field trip in mind, there's quite a few examples of malls that have been regreened and added density. This is in Vancouver, Surrey City, British Columbia. Some of the more aggressive, progressive architecture pushing the mall further. Quite a few new urbanist folks doing like that sort of thing. Duane Plater-Zyberg, a Miami new urbanist firm, creating traditional downtowns out of malls, mall sites. Downtown Kendall near Miami is another one that's incrementally coming through. Lots of new residential development there. And then looking at some interesting small injection notions. You know, if you have a parking garage, can you put affordable housing on top of it? If you have a large parking garage, could that become an autonomous vehicle station? If you have a large parking garage, could that become an urban farm? So these are all new future sustainable events that I think we'll be looking at if autonomous vehicles and shared vehicles increase, the demand for parking space will decrease. So what do you do with all the parking infrastructure that you've spent? Parking garages don't last forever, of course. They only have 20, 30-year lifespan. But what can those parking garages or structured parking be used for? Could they become urban farms? Could they be converted to other things? So one example from our experience, this is in Emerson Heights, East 10th Street in Indianapolis, a Kroger site in the middle of a fairly dense urban neighborhood with a lot of historic bungalows. So this was a retrofit of a large patch of asphalt. So picking up on some of those key ideas that Jones was talking about, regreening, looking at opportunities for bioswales, water retention. I put an amphitheater at the south end, trying to regreen some of that asphalt and capture stormwater, add more density. Of course, the Hardee's is very important on that side of town, very close to one of the community hospitals. But then maybe converting the back half behind the Kroger into a senior living village with assisted living or skilled nursing, maybe a branch library or community center, and an amphitheater with lots of stormwater retention. So that back of house or that back of big box store land that often is forgotten, regreening that into more walkable civic infrastructure. Another thing I always like to do too is reconnect. Notice how many streets are cut off from this? A dead end or T against the lot. That's pretty typical, right? So in an older part of Indianapolis, when this was developed in the teens and 20s, they would inject these suburban style shopping centers into the middle of the city grid. And notice how many streets are cut off. So one strategy I often talk about is the reconnectivity back into the neighborhood. And that's important from a lot of different standpoints. So you can reach the grocery store by foot or by bike or by stroller, as opposed to just driving there. So that reconnectivity back into the neighborhood. As we look at security too, the notion of urbanizing a lot of those suburban shopping malls in Colorado, because Colorado, as you know, it's a bit of a mass shooting problem. Okay? It has a gun problem. And so an enclosed suburban style shopping mall is not going to be seen as a very safe place. A urban street grid where there's lots of ways in and out is going to be potentially seen as a more safe place. See what I mean? The perception can be very volatile and very overnight if suburban shopping malls are not seen as safe places. And where I grew up in mid-Michigan, in Lansing, there were two large malls. One was seen as not safe, and it declined within 2 or 3 years. It just went right down because it was not seen as a safe place to be because of the propensity for gun violence. So we continue remainder of the suburban shopping mall may not be sustainable from that standpoint, as opposed to streets that have large connectivity with lots of routes in and out. So that's an unfortunate byproduct of our current news, but that is, when it comes down to site planning and design, perceived safety is everything. And so, and either you address the gun problem or you address the spatial problem, or vice versa. Lots of good things for your generation to figure out, because clearly this problem has been lingering for years. Other design competitions around the subject of dead malls or dead strips have been published. Lots of great diagrams and studies from folks like Nathan Cherry, who's the former director of urban design at RTKL, now part of Callison. Ironically, the Suburban shopping center didn't always look like it did. This is Country Club Plaza in Kansas City, Missouri. It was a portion of Kansas City that was imagined or inspired by Seville, Spain. And it's one of the early shopping malls from 1910, 1920 that had all the parking in the center courtyard of each block. If we could just figure that out, right? It ends up being a much more urban place, because the early automobile was seen as something that one only used as an accessory to walking. And so the demand of parking right outside of a door was less the case. So the parking was in the indoor courtyard, and then the edges were all very urban. Other interesting ones include Reston Town Center. This is Suburban DC. This is an early one by RTKL, late 70s, early 80s, and it's grown up into a very identifiable downtown with lots of open space, splash pads, market space, connections to structured parking, connections to through the alleys. That's where restaurants like to locate, is on these active alleys that connect to structured parking. So very suburban place, but injecting urbanity into it. Back to Nathan Cherry's studio, doing figure ground studies of all of these to try to understand what makes them tick. It often comes down back to the figure ground as a way of understanding how a place works or doesn't work, and then starting with a lot of those interesting connectivity diagrams and making comparisons across different successful urban retail districts. So a fascinating group of diagrams that Nathan Cherry published in the early aughts. Google Earth, and just using Google Earth and analyzing space with Google Earth can give you a pretty good idea of how much parking a site really needs by just looking at it in Google Earth. You often can find, oh, this lot is way oversized, and so you can start some analytical studies by saying, well, we can see where people are parking, we can see where people aren't parking, and we then use that underperforming asphalt as an opportunity for infill. So these are previous diagrams from previous years analyzing the parking that's actually being used in this particular site in Carmel, and then looking at the potential for redevelopment there. So the steps we'll use today will be something of this nature. We'll analyze the site, take a look at the parking that is in use, identify opportunities for infill, and then draw the site plan based on the steps and techniques that we learned last week. And it'll look something like this. So the idea of injecting housing or injecting mixed use into the underperforming aspects of the site can make it a much richer environment there for the future. Okay. So let's take a look at our site. This is Clay Terrace in Carmel, Keystone Boulevard, 31, just north of Central Carmel. It is injected into leftover land next to suburban development. It has a series of roundabouts connecting either side of Keystone Parkway, has additional retail to the north, but this was a suburban answer to recreation of a small town Main Street using a shopping mall anchor layout. And the anchors have experienced some turnover. This is a Dick's Sporting Goods. This used to be a Circuit City. It's now a gym. Different civic functions have started to creep in, nonprofits, things of that nature as the retail has passed through. Banks, of course, I mean, banks are rare. So there's some opportunities here to consider. Some regreening opportunities. There's a large retention pond here. There is a swale over here. There is a walking trail that is active, but as you can see, only a portion of the parking is being used. Okay, so this is being used. Not only a portion of that, none of this, these are alleys that connect you to the main street. They are active laneways or walks, but you can just quickly diagram now the portions of the parking that are being used. People do like the on-street parking, that's fairly popular. Street width is pretty wide, it's about 35. This model of retail development is quite popular. So there are more than one of these across the country. You do have two fairly active central squares. The anchors, or the big boxes on the edges, and portions of the asphalt or the parking lots that are mixtures of employee parking. That is important to remember, that the employee parking is typically at the rear. Employees do enter retail establishments from the rear. But we do see large expanses of underperforming asphalt. So one of the first decisions to make is, what are we keeping? If we just assume that we're keeping the street wall of the retail buildings that are there, we would then respect them as part of our decision making. Those can become part of the diagram. We do have loading docks, things like that to think about, trash receptacles and the like. So make some decisions about what you would like to keep in the plan. This is a red robin over here. questions about the big boxes, whether you keep those or not. These are some questions about the long-term sustainability of those big boxes. This initial diagram here can be very analytical about what is being used, what is not being used. And take the form of a conceptual diagram or bubble diagram. So looking for connections into the neighborhood. Better connection or interface. Notice there's nothing back here. Absolutely nothing. Maybe thinking about some connections into the neighborhood. What else would you like to do? So we want to consider how much land is not being used. If you're going to develop housing against Keystone Parkway, which is fairly loud, then you have to design it so that way while still accommodating the eastern sun. This is north, that's east, that's west, that's south. So let's think about an orientation of block design that accommodates eastern sun, right? You can turn your back to the highway, but you then shut off any opportunity. So the more eastern sun that can penetrate a block, the better you wake up. The eastern sun wakes you up, right? That's what gets you through the day. So we could start to think about a block pattern that allows for a lot of solar penetration from the east. I'll use the marker for that. We can just start to lay out a pattern, as Brett says, of 2 to 3 story housing. Has a lot of eastern solar penetration. So the eastern sun is penetrating into as many of these denser apartments as possible. Really wakes everybody up in the morning. Over here, similar thing, we can do a block like this. Okay. All right, so if we keep this, I think this is the Dick's Sporting Goods, that one. But then we continued maybe our block pattern, keep this park, and then we can reorient some new housing around the swale. That Circuit City has died. I think it's had a couple of deaths already. This becomes a block pattern that allows eastern sun to penetrate many, many, many apartment units. Maybe I can put a chain hotel or something like that on the corner here. Past classes we started taking over this neighborhood, but to be honest, that can get pretty costly. I mean, if you're starting to do property acquisition at that level, there's enough folks there that are just fine where they are, and property acquisition can get a little tricky. Okay. So that was a first overlay. Has some analytical thinking as well as looking at potential infill. That gets us ready for overlay. So I'll go to my fine liner and draw in existing and proposed as all the streets, layouts, open space. I basically just do a big old outline of everything using the fine line. Switch line weights now. We're going to go to the bolder line weight. The Pentel sign pattern. Add a thicker line weight to your proposed buildings. That will make them pop relative to the other information that's there. Per our exercise last week, it's the line weights that start to communicate the proposed buildings against the existing. Make a little solar diagram. Pick a time of day for the sun to be casting. So this is AM, noon. Whoops. North is this way. So I need to make a solar diagram here. Noon, AM, PM. So mid-morning sun would be this direction. So this is my solar diagram with mid-morning sun coming from that angle. Very important I caught that, because north is not up, north is to the left. And so this solar diagram on front here will help me to make appropriate morning shadows. I'm going to take the Sharpie chisel marker, and using that angle I'm going to create a cast shadow, like so. This will illustrate the impact of mid-morning sun on the proposed development and help support that notion of eastern sun for our new residents. The eastern sun is so critical for the success of residential development. So if nobody's waking up in the morning, then that starts to add to the hierarchy of line and the readability of the entire plan. We also use the shadow to help illustrate height. Of course, taller buildings have longer cast shadows, and the potential solar impact of a taller structure onto spaces below. On a plan of this nature, you could use gray as well, but I'm going to use the black just for the maximum impact of this new development onto the plan. So it really, really reads at this scale, this notion of the thick black marker, all that other information. If you have roof lines, desired roof lines or necessary roof lines, since we've just experienced a rainwater event, this is the stage where you can start to add the roof lines and continue to break up the monotony of some masses versus others. It just adds another level of detail, readability to the plan. And another opportunity for you to suggest or propose different articulations of the architecture, little towers on the corners, or solar arrays, PV panels, or habitable urban gardens or roof gardens, roof terraces. These are all things that you can start to populate in the plan if you wish. check my work. Make sure everything's closed. There's no huge gaps. There's large, thicker areas of foliage and forested cover are drawn as masses. Individual trees in the plan as circles. Put in a few more. And then I'll remove the other layers and put this over. I'm on the back. Existing buildings are going to get a 6 cool gray. Existing buildings get a 6 gray. This indicates to the viewer that they are there, but it causes their graphic hierarchy to recede. You're still reading them as building footprints against all the other information, but not as severe as we would in a figure ground. It has the same impact as a figure ground, but they're not as severe, and so the graphic hierarchy, an existing building will tend to fade in the graphic hierarchy, the graphic attention that our viewer is taking. Our emphasis is on the systems, circulation systems, the natural systems, and our proposed infill development. A little bit of blue for our pond and our swale. Of course, it's not going to appear blue at all. It's going to appear black. That water is dirty, but that should be rendered black, but it's not what our client expects. Our clients read water, they expect to see blue. So we are somewhat fulfilling their expectations. Next, I'll take an apple green or a grass green. Well, actually, let me start with a willow green. I'm going to lay a willow green over our neighborhoods here. This is a thin green. And just start to create an edge. feather that out. Blend that. I'll just feather this out. Now, there are some quote-unquote green areas in between these different highway lanes. I'll use the willow green just to lay that in. Just becomes part of the visual hierarchy of the highway there. Using the toe of the marker, I'll lightly start to regreen these portions of the swale. Then with either apple green or grass green, I'm going to add an edge of a little more medium green to that. Edge of attention and color against that willow green. You can start to see what that does. It creates an edge for our eye to follow, to communicate the edge of the neighborhood against the development. So that combination of the willow green and the grass green or apple green reinforces the edge of the development. I'll then use that apple green or grass green and start to populate the trees that we have in our parking areas. So what that does, makes the edge of the development recede and puts our attention into the center of the development. It's very similarly how you would sort of fade your site plan into the context with the Photoshop technique. You would sort of fade into the edges of the context, edges of the site into the context. Similar graphic psychology that you're using here to blend the development into the context. So that's a combination of willow green and grass green. I can now take an emerald green or a slate green. These are my two darkest greens. Very carefully and judiciously reinforce those trees with a little bit of this bluish green. You get a little bit of color play there, and it just reinforces the three-dimensional illusion that you're trying to make. Willow green, apple green and grass green have a lot of yellow in it. The slate green and the emerald green have more blue in them. So you get a little bit of that interplay of yellow and blue in your green palettes. Using a little bit of color blending stuff here, a little bit of color psychology too. This is on the shaded side of each clump of trees, or on the shaded side of each tree. Sometimes it's necessary to make them pop a little more. Again, we're drawing people into the center of the plan. If we're using land use colors, all of our housing can use either chrome orange or goldenrod. I'll just apply goldenrod over all of these, representing multifamily housing in the land use color scheme. Gaps where I've missed things. Exceptions would include areas in which we are proposing more retail on the ground floor. Perhaps this building has some red as part of a retail ground floor as it faces the park. So it's like putting lipstick on the building, but that would represent additional retail on the ground floor. Selection of colored pencils and just reinforce the colors that are there. Back to my solar diagram, I'll add a little bit of extra color to the shaded side of each building. Given that I elected to show slope roofs. Colored pencils also fill in any gaps you might have. This is one way of using land use colors to illustrate multiple land uses on successive floors. So retail on the ground floor, residential above. I just want a soft diagonal stroke on my existing buildings. Just give them a little bit of texture. I feel like they're a little flat. So this diagonal color pencil wash just gives them a little more texture. Something's reading a little flat, just add some colored pencil to it. It gives it more life. Asphalt remains white. we were to add more gray to this, it would start competing and muddying out a lot of the information we have. It's not worth it. Diagrammatically and in terms of color, in terms of the color theory and the color psychology we're after here, putting in color on the asphalt would just, it starts to compete too much with the other information we have on the plan. So I'm from the school of thought that says you leave the asphalt white and you have to let the colors communicate what they need to communicate. You're not competing with that. Back on the front, I'm looking for any gaps. Little gaps in color, I'm just filling those in. And that is the Suburban Retrofitting infill proposal.